Welcome to Book Talk. I'm Stephen Usery, and we're joined today by Warren St. John. Thanks for stopping by, Warren.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Warren St. John is a journalist for the New York Times and is the author of Rammer Jammer Yellow Hammer. And Spiegel and Grouse recently published his newest book, Outcasts United, a refugee team, an American town. Warren, what brought you to the story of a soccer team made up of refugee children in Clarkston, Georgia?
Well, I was just in Atlanta giving a talk for my first book, and got asked out to dinner by a couple who'd read it, and the husband happened to work in refugee resettlement in Atlanta. And I think I knew a little bit about refugee resettlement, but I wasn't really aware that it was happening in Atlanta, and I didn't know much about the process, and I asked him a lot of questions about it. And about midway through the dinner, he sort of leaned back and said, "You know, there's a soccer team of refugee kids that you might want to check out." And I was intrigued, got the coach's number, and called her, and they happened to be playing the next day. And then I went and saw a game. This incredible drama unfurled unexpectedly in front of me, and I quickly got hooked on the story.
Now, the driving force behind the team is Luma Mufle?
Yes, Luma Mufle, yes.
And she's a young woman for Jordan. How did she get to America?
Well, Luma, like so many people in Clarkston, is someone who's sort of been untethered from her life and from the familiar. She grew up in Amman to a wealthy Jordanian family, very socially prominent, and went to college at Smith in Northampton, Massachusetts, where coincidentally my sister went to college, so I know the school quite well. And after college, she decided that she was going to stay in America. She liked the opportunity here. She liked, in particular, what America offered to a woman in terms of the ability to chart her own course. And she called her parents and gave them this news, and they were outraged. And they completely disowned her and cut her off financially. They wouldn't speak to her. They hung up the phone on her for the next 5 years whenever she called. And so she had to find her way, and eventually she drifted to Atlanta, Georgia, and ran into this group of kids playing soccer in a parking lot, and learned about them, learned about their stories. They were refugees from war-torn regions all over the world, and had no options for any kind of activities. She decided she would start a soccer team and coach. She had some experience coaching, but what started out as, a small act of helping a few kids out quickly began to take over her life.
Now, she became interested in soccer very early on in her life back in Jordan.
She did. She played. She was athletic as a child, and she would watch the men play and the older boys play from the backyard of her grandmother's house in Amman, and sometimes she would go join in the game herself, and that was very unusual for girls in Jordan, and so she loved the game. She had a real appreciation for the beauty of the game, and that's something that she would later try to teach her players.
And ironically enough, her coaching style was instilled in her by an American who was teaching in Jordan.
That's right. So she had a volleyball coach in high school. She went to the American Community School in Amman, which is where all the diplomats' children go. It's just basically like an American prep school in the middle of Jordan. And she had this volleyball coach named Rhonda Brown, and Rhonda was tough and made her players run all the time and work really hard. But she would join in with them. She would run with them. She would do the things that she asked her players to do. And Luma told me, she said, I hated her, but I wanted to please her. And as she matured, she realized she didn't really hate her. She resented having to do some of the things that the coach was ordering her to do, but part of the reason she resented them was because on some level she knew those things were probably good for her. And she later took that philosophy to her kids. And one of the ironies of life in Clarkston is that Luma, here's Luma Mufle from Jordan coaching these refugee kids, and they're getting a lot of grief from the Americans in town. But what Luma is teaching the kids, self-discipline, self-reliance, personal responsibility, an intense work ethic, these are all very traditional American, maybe even conservative values. And the townsfolk didn't allow themselves to get close enough to hear how much they might have in common and how much they might approve of her philosophy.
Now, Clarkston, Georgia is where so many of these refugees were settled. How did so many come to Clarkston in particular? It's a small town, 1 square mile just about. And what was the city like before they came?
Well, Clarkston was a tiny little town by the railroad tracks where nothing interesting had really ever occurred. Baptist Church was built there in 1880, and it was just sort of the classic little town where nothing happened and everyone was happy that way. And in the late 80s, refugee resettlement agencies, these are the agencies that take in refugees once they're into this country, meet them at the airport, find them an apartment to live in, help them get jobs. They decided Clarkston might make a good home for refugees. It had a bunch of dilapidated apartments that could be rented for cheap. It was near public transportation, which is important because refugees don't have cars and can't afford cars. And it was also near Atlanta. And Atlanta had this booming economy with lots of need for low-skilled workers to work as maids in hotels and work in poultry processing plants and that sort of thing. So they put a few refugees from Southeast Asia in Clarkston. Sort of worked out. They put some from the Balkan conflicts, and that worked out. And so they just kept putting them in this little town. And it took the town quite a while to realize, hey, wait a minute, who are these people whose language we can't understand and who dress differently than we do, and that's really when the trouble started.
Now, we can assume there would be some level of knee-jerk reaction, especially in a small town, to a bunch of people with different cultures coming in. But how much do you think the underfunding and understaffing of the refugee services led to this, that they just weren't there for the refugees a lot of times?
Well, in the book, I try to get at all these complexities. You're exactly right that to simplify it and paint, this is a case of simple villains against do-gooders, I think would be a disservice to everyone because it's just a lot more complicated than that. And there's no doubt that this little town was given very little in the way of resources to deal with this incredible change. Suddenly the police had to figure out a way to communicate to people from different languages and different cultures who spoke different languages. The court system had to deal with the same. The schools, although they were part of the county school system, they're right there in town. Teachers suddenly had to figure out, well, how do we make this work? And so there was a great burden placed on Clarkston and little given to the town to help them out. And that said, there were also some just basic resentments that anybody from outside was coming in and changing the nature of this town, and sometimes that resentment took ugly forms.
Now, Luma started coaching boys soccer,
Yeah,
and dealing with teenage boys is tough on the best of days and under the best of circumstances.
true.
But you add in these boys are not only outsiders, but immigrants who've literally fled for their lives in many cases. And they're fighting for their existence, and they've witnessed so many indescribable horrors and atrocities. That's
Yeah.
an especially huge challenge.
Well, it's definitely sort of the ultimate at-risk population. You're right. Many of them have been through horrors that we can't imagine. They've lived in refugee camps, and when they get here, it's not like it's all over. It's sort of one series of difficulties has ended and another series of difficulties begins. And I think the thing that I saw every day in reporting, and you'll see this as you read the book, it is these kids trying to find their place, trying to figure out, okay, who am I? Am I an American now that we live here and we're not going back to our country? Or am I, from Congo and Liberia and responsible for upholding the cultural traditions of those places? And the painful thing that I saw was the way these kids were locked out of both of those worlds. They would go to school, and the American kids would tease them for their accents or make fun of them for coming from places that the other kids had never heard of. Then the teenage refugees would try to adjust to fit in. They'd change the way they dressed, change their hairstyle, change the way they talk, and they'd go home, and mom, usually mom, because they're mostly single-parent families, would say, "What are you doing? We don't dress like that. We don't talk like that. We don't wear our hair like that in our country. You've got to be respectful of our traditions. And by the way, you know what I went through to get you here safely." So they're stuck between these worlds and not really fully a part of either. And that was something that was ongoing every day. The horrors that they experienced definitely affected their personalities in various ways, but those things were also in the past. This other struggle to find a place in the world was unfurling every day, and could be wrenching. And what was really cool was the way Luma carved out this safe place in the middle of all this chaos, where it didn't matter who you were. Every kid was so different from the next kid. There was no kind of normal to aspire to, and that put everyone at ease, and that helped kids get a firmer footing, start developing a little bit of self-confidence and self-esteem.
Now, why were young men from Liberia at particular risk?
So the Liberian kids were arriving after 14 years of civil war, and much of the war was fought in a way that involved child soldiers. So there were kids who, if they hadn't fought themselves, they had an older brother who had fought, or they knew other kids who had fought. So the idea of banding together with other young people with weapons and creating your own hierarchy that was sort of separate and outside of society was something that was familiar to them in some way. And that's exactly what youth gangs do in a way. And also Liberian kids speak English. It's heavily accented, but kids from Monrovia, they know all the hip hop tunes that American kids know. They can understand English, so they actually fit quite easily into the flourishing gang culture in this area outside of Atlanta. And so the Liberian kids that Luma dealt with were maybe more so than other kids getting pulled in the direction of the gangs. Again, they wanted to belong to something. They wanted respect from other people. And when you feel powerless, you might feel that joining up with this other group of kids would get you the respect that you feel you're entitled to, but that you can't quite get.
Now, it's almost a stereotype in America that African Americans are resentful to some degree of African immigrants. Did you see much of that with the refugees and the local African Americans who had lived in Clarkston for quite some time?
A little bit, but I would just say that means that the African Americans in Clarkston were just like the white Americans in Clarkston. There was resentment towards the way life had changed, and then in Clarkston you have this very limited set of resources. There's one sort of rundown community center that had recently been spruced up a bit with a field out back. There was one general purpose field in the public park. So you didn't have really one basketball court in town behind the elementary school. So you have a lot of young people vying for not much space, and different people had different senses of their entitlement or their connection to that space. This is our town, so we should be able to play on our field, to play the games we want to play. So I certainly wouldn't say it was any more resentment among the African Americans in Clarkston, but there was resentment on par with the resentment that other town residents felt and expressed.
Now, when Luma got the team together, they started to practice at the community center.
Yeah.
What led to the split that led the community center to ask them to leave?
Well, the community center, like so many things in Clarkston, became up for grabs. And here was this place to play in this building that was sort of empty, and you could teach classes in it or have different activities. And the Americans in town they were already integrated into other parts of life in Atlanta, their churches, schools, civic groups. So they weren't at a loss for a space to do things. Refugees had none of that. So when they had this little community center, they flocked to it. They were thrilled to have a community center, and they loved the idea of interacting with other Americans. They all want to meet Americans and talk to them and learn about this new country. They wanted their kids to play soccer out back. And then this argument developed. Well, is this a community center for Clarkston, the old community that's always been here? Or is it a refugee center? Is it a center for this new type of town that, is undefined, but it seems to involve a lot of international influences? And a tug of war developed, and the board of the community center eventually sort of raised the stakes for use of the field, and the refugee soccer teams had to leave. They couldn't pay what was required, or what was asked of them, and in that way, the Clarkston Community Center was sort of wrested away from the refugee community and used primarily for a time by older residents, or not really used at all.
Now, there was a great pitch available to them at Milam Park in the heart of Clarkston, but was it Mayor Swaney or Swanee?
Swaney, yeah.
Swaney. Not only was he arbitrary and capricious, but almost a bit bipolar in his attachment to this little bit of grass.
Yeah. Well, I think of Mayor Swaney as, he's not a doesn't come across as a particularly malevolent character, but he seemed to be someone who was always trying to please everybody, and in the process, please no one and upset most people. He saw to it that this group of Sudanese refugees, they call themselves the Lost Boys soccer team, they're members of the Lost Boys of Sudan, he kicked them off the field in the town park. And a bit of a controversy erupted locally, and he was asked by a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about this, and he said, as long as I'm mayor, there'll only be baseball played in the town park. That field wasn't made for soccer. Well, if you drive up to the park there in Clarkston, there's an old faded sign next to the field, and it's got a picture of three balls down at the bottom. There's a baseball, a football, and a soccer ball. So whoever built that park, whoever put that sign up below these many years ago, didn't really have a problem with soccer balls rolling on the grass of Milam Park. And what he seemed to be saying was he had a problem with who was playing it. Lots of refugee kids, and it's true that they had a real enthusiasm for the game. It was social time. It was a meeting place, the park, and they loved to play soccer, so they would play it as long as they possibly could. But when he effectively banned soccer from the park, one of the brutal ironies of this decision was that there was no Little League baseball team in Clarkston, so and hadn't been for quite a while. So the field was just empty, and you had all these kids desperate to play a game, and this big, beautiful rectangle of grass right in the middle of town, and effectively no one was allowed to use it.
Now, some residents, instead of retreating into their homes and into their own communities, or even just leaving town altogether, did decide that they had to adapt. Can you talk about some of the moves that were made to?
I think my favorite anecdote is the story of Bill Mellinger, who's I think he would describe himself as a good old boy from Tucker, Georgia, son of an egg salesman, meat cutter at Winn-Dixie. He started out as a meat cutter trainee, worked his way up to district manager, and had this dream to buy his own grocery store. So he bought Thrift Town, a private grocery store right there in the Clarkston Shopping Center. And he bought it right about the time resettlement really started to get going, and the older residents of town started leaving in droves. Well, that was his customer base. And these new people who were coming in didn't buy the sort of things he sold. The potato chips and peanut butter and jelly and white bread. It's not anything that they were interested in. So he was losing business. He had to borrow 10 grand from his father's retirement, and was certain he was going to be foreclosed upon. And a young part-time employee who's also going to school there was a woman from, she was a I believe, Vietnamese refugee. And she said to Mr. Mellinger, our people can't get the food that we like to eat. And maybe if you got a little of that food, I could tell people and they might come buy your stuff. Well, Mr. Mellinger says, I don't know the first thing about what kind of food you eat. And he said, well, there's a store across town, let's go. Get in his van, go to the store. He buys a bunch of stuff. He goes writing it down and trying to find people to supply it. Actually goes back and starts taking notes on what other people are buying in this Asian market on the other side of town. And eventually gets some Southeast Asian food, puts it on the shelf. She tells her friends and family, and boom, it's gone. Fast forward to today, and Thrift Town is this wild international market with dozens of refugee employees who also act as food consultants to their own people's cuisine. And you've got, the Bosnian candy and bread over here next to the African cassava over here, 50-pound burlap bags of rice over here. And in the meantime, a Publix and Kroger opened up down the street, which surely would have put Thrift Town out of business if Mellinger hadn't adjusted. And he's thriving. He's found his niche, and he spends all his free time going to refugee weddings on weekends. And his life has been transformed. But it was interesting to me because he didn't do this as an act of altruism to help people out. He did it out of his own self-interest, but he found a way, and the refugee community around him found a way to meld self-interest so that everyone benefited. And in some way, that's one of the lessons of Clarkston, is you have to look for those opportunities. You can't depend entirely on people's altruism or goodwill to power you through these complications.
And you brought up the sociological concept of super diversity.
Yeah.
And in those situations that people have to learn from the bottom up. You can't impose tolerance and compassion from up.
Exactly. I think, in our country we've tried various efforts of the government mandating certain rules to make people get along. And in general, those aren't that effective. You have to create an environment where people can naturally connect on their own. People are resentful of being told what they should do and who they should be friends with and how they should treat other people. But super diversity is this term coined by a British sociologist to describe this new kind of diversity that we experience, where it's no longer just white, black, and brown, but you might have Sudanese refugees living next to Somali refugees, next to white Southerners, and the Sudanese are from the north of Sudan and the south of Sudan, two totally distinct regions that in fact have been at war with each other. So there are all these overlaying connections and differences, and in that situation it gets really hard to keep track of who's who and what group do various people belong to. In some ways that may make it easier, because it's hard to, if you think of everyone as an individual as opposed to a member of a group, then group identity politics kind of fall away. And so in some ways super diversity may be more conducive to connections than situations where you have one group of people over here and another group of people over here kind of eyeing each other with suspicion.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there's no real villains and no pure altruism heroes involved in this. And Coach Luma, and a lot of times, would kind of dress things up as lessons, but in some ways she was petulant as well.
I try to, Luma is Luma. She's stubborn, she's strong-headed. That comes in really handy when you're taking on all the misconceptions or preconceptions of a town. But she's a human being, and like all of us, she has her moments where the stress just gets to her, and she expresses her frustration, sometimes clumsily, or sometimes it comes out in a rush. And I thought that was important to include in the book, because I think it would be a great disservice if people read this book and what they take away is, well, in order to change a community, you need to go find a saintly character who can come in and sprinkle magic dust on everyone and make everyone get along. That's not what she's done. She's a person She doesn't have some set of answers or some philosophy that makes everything clear. She's just a person working hard, doing her best, trying to adhere to some basic principles of fairness and kindness towards others. And when she screws up or gets mad, she just keeps going. And to me, that was really admirable. And I thought that it was important to capture that side of her personality because, if you say to yourself, well, that person's a saint, then you're sort of off the hook, right? Or we all are off the hook because, I'm not a saint, so I guess I just don't have what it takes to affect my community. I'll wait for that next person who does to come along. That's really not the lesson of Luma's experience in Clarkston. The lesson is anybody can make a difference if they're just willing to do work and adhere to some basic principles of fairness and kindness towards other people.
Now, there is talk of making the story into a movie, right?
There is talk of it, yes. And I will sort of Luma and I joke that we expect to be wheeled out of the old folks' home for the premiere. Hollywood moves at their own pace, which I don't quite understand. And I think it's such a complex story. It would be a challenge to capture it, I think, accurately.
Well, you have a lot of traditional sports movie archetypes. You have the gruff but lovable coach, a group of outcasts, all sorts of different personality types. But can you please kind of promise us that it won't end with a big game cliche?
I can't promise that, but I can promise you that the book doesn't. And I think, in all seriousness, it's a really complicated story, and there isn't a Hollywood ending to the story because the story is going on right now. There are refugees from Burma arriving, from Burundi, from Iraq, people who helped the U.S. effort in Iraq who can't go back to their homes. They're coming to Clarkston. And all of these groups have needs and fears, and in all of their experience, I think there are lessons for the rest of us. Personally, I've been completely transformed just from reporting on this world. First of all, I don't think I'll ever complain with a good conscience again. It's made me so grateful for what we have in this country. We're safe for the most part. We can get clean drinking water. Our friends and family are accessible to us. We don't get stopped randomly on the street or when we go to the store. And these are things that much of the world doesn't enjoy. But we also are lucky to have a sense of place and security. And that's a very elusive thing for a lot of people in the world. And I think the kids who come here and their families, it's interesting, they have such incredible hopes for America. They've heard so much about life here, and they're so excited. And it sort of reminds you, and this story and what Luma has done reminds you of all of the best things about our country. Where else in the world could a group of kids from all over the place with no economic advantages at all and a woman coach come together and succeed in this way?
Well, Warren, thank you so much for sharing this story with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Warren St. John is the author of Outcasts United, a refugee team in American Town. It's available from Spiegel and Grau. I'm Stephen Usery, and this is Book Talk.
A broadcast service of the Memphis Public Libraries and the City of Memphis.